In just moments, a routine discussion unravels, turning into a tense and surprising on-air exchange no one saw coming. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It began as a fairly typical segment on The View, the kind viewers have come to expect: structured, conversational, and centered around current topics in entertainment and culture. The panel was seated as usual, with Sunny Hostin positioned among her co-hosts, prepared with notes and ready to guide the discussion into something meaningful. The audience had already settled into that familiar rhythm of attentive listening, occasional laughter, and polite applause. On this particular episode, the focus shifted toward the role of comedy in addressing serious social issues. It was introduced as a thoughtful conversation, not a confrontational one. The idea was to explore how comedians navigate boundaries, what they can say, what they should say, and how audiences respond. That's when the guest for the segment, Chris Rock, joined the discussion. As he walked onto the stage, the audience greeted him with warm applause. His presence immediately changed the energy in the room, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that felt sharper, more focused. He took his seat, exchanged greetings, and the conversation began in a calm and measured tone. Sunny Hostin started by acknowledging his long career in comedy and his influence on the industry. She framed her first question carefully, referencing how comedy has often intersected with sensitive cultural conversations. Her tone was respectful but deliberate, suggesting that she wanted to move beyond surface-level discussion. Chris Rock responded in a way that matched the tone: measured, thoughtful, and slightly reserved. He spoke about comedy as a reflection of society, emphasizing that comedians often say things others are thinking, but may not express openly. His delivery was calm, and the audience responded with light nods and a few murmurs of agreement. At this stage, everything felt balanced. The hosts allowed him space to speak, occasionally adding their own perspectives. The pacing was steady, with no interruptions that felt out of place. It was the kind of exchange that daytime television often aims for: engaging but controlled. However, the shift began when Sunny Hostin introduced a more pointed perspective. She referenced how some audiences have become more critical of certain types of humor, particularly when it touches on personal or social sensitivities. Her wording remained professional, but there was a noticeable change in emphasis. She wasn't just asking a general question anymore. She was inviting a more direct response. Chris Rock paused briefly before answering. It wasn't an uncomfortable pause, but it was enough for viewers to notice. He leaned slightly forward, his hands moving subtly as he prepared to respond. His answer started calmly, as he explained that comedy has always evolved with the times. He acknowledged that audiences change and that comedians adapt. But then he added something that shifted the tone. He suggested that while sensitivity is important, there is also a risk of overanalyzing humor to the point where it loses its purpose. His voice remained steady, but the phrasing carried a firmer edge. The audience reaction was subtle, some quiet agreement, a few scattered claps, but the panel's body language began to shift. Sunny Hostin listened closely, her expression focused. She didn't interrupt immediately, but it was clear she was preparing to respond. When she did, her tone remained composed, but her words were more direct. She pointed out that for some viewers, certain jokes don't feel harmless, they feel personal. She emphasized that public figures, especially comedians with large platforms, have an influence that goes beyond entertainment. At this moment, the dynamic changed. It wasn't confrontational, but it was no longer purely conversational either. The exchange had become more pointed, with each side presenting a clear perspective. Chris Rock responded without raising his voice, but his tone became more defined. He acknowledged her point, but clarified his own position. He explained that comedy often involves discomfort, and that discomfort can lead to important conversations. He stressed that intention matters, and that not every joke is meant to offend. As he spoke, he used his hands more expressively, a natural part of his communication style. The audience remained attentive, with fewer audible reactions now, as if trying to follow the nuance of the discussion. Sunny Hostin leaned slightly forward, maintaining eye contact. She nodded at certain points, but didn't fully concede. When she spoke again, she carefully reiterated that impact can matter more than intention, especially for audiences who feel represented or misrepresented by what they hear. This exchange marked the first clear moment of tension. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was unmistakable. The rhythm of the conversation slowed, with each response carrying more weight. One of the co-hosts briefly stepped in, attempting to balance the discussion by acknowledging both perspectives. This is a common dynamic on shows like The View, ensuring that conversations remain respectful and inclusive. The interjection helped ease the pacing slightly, but it didn't fully reset the tone. Chris Rock listened, then added another point. He spoke about the role of audience interpretation, suggesting that different people will always react differently to the same material. His voice remained calm, but his phrasing was more deliberate now, as if choosing each word carefully. Sunny Hostin responded with a measured counterpoint, emphasizing responsibility. She didn't raise her voice, but her delivery carried a quiet firmness. She acknowledged the complexity of the issue, but maintained that public figures have to be aware of how their words are received. At this stage, the audience could feel the shift. The conversation was no longer just informative. It had become a genuine exchange of differing viewpoints. The kind that doesn't escalate into conflict, but also doesn't resolve easily. Chris Rock gave a slight nod, acknowledging her perspective, but he didn't step back from his position. He clarified that he believes in the importance of open dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable. His tone suggested that he saw this very conversation as an example of that principle. The panel remained engaged, with each host watching closely. There were no interruptions, but the energy in the room had clearly changed. It was more focused, more deliberate, and slightly more tense than when the segment began. As the discussion continued, the balance between agreement and disagreement remained delicate. Neither side dismissed the other, but neither fully aligned either. It was the kind of exchange that reflects real conversations, layered, nuanced, and sometimes unresolved. And as the segment moved forward, it became clear that this wasn't just a passing moment. It was developing into something that viewers would continue to talk about, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it felt real, measured, and reflective of broader conversations happening beyond the studio. The tone had shifted, the perspectives had been clearly drawn, and the stage was set for the discussion to deepen even further. As the conversation continued, the shift in tone that had begun to take shape became more noticeable, not through raised voices or interruptions, but through the careful pacing of each response. On The View, moments like this tend to unfold gradually, and this was no exception. The panel remained composed, but there was a clear awareness that the discussion had moved into more serious territory. Sunny Hostin leaned back slightly after making her last point, giving space for Chris Rock to respond. It wasn't a pause filled with discomfort, but it was deliberate, one of those brief silences that signals the importance of what comes next. The audience, which had been quietly attentive, seemed to settle even further, with fewer murmurs and almost no movement. Chris Rock took a moment before speaking again. He adjusted his posture, sitting a bit more upright, and then began in a tone that remained calm, but carried a clearer sense of intention. He acknowledged Sunny's emphasis on impact, agreeing that how people receive something matters. But he also introduced a distinction that slightly reframed the discussion. He explained that, in his view, comedy often operates in a space where intention and interpretation don't always align, and that this tension is part of what makes it effective. As he spoke, his delivery became a little more structured, almost as if he were carefully building his point step by step. He talked about how comedians test boundaries, not necessarily to offend, but to explore ideas in a way that encourages audiences to think differently. His hands moved subtly as he spoke, reinforcing certain phrases without becoming overly animated. Sunny Hostin listened closely, her expression focused and thoughtful. She nodded occasionally, but her posture suggested she was preparing to respond rather than simply agreeing. When he finished, she leaned forward again slightly, maintaining eye contact before beginning her reply. Her tone remained measured, but there was a quiet firmness in her words. She acknowledged that comedy can indeed challenge perspectives, but she emphasized that the line between challenging and harming can sometimes be difficult to define. She pointed out that for some viewers, especially those who feel directly affected by certain topics, humor doesn't always feel like exploration. It can feel like dismissal. The way she phrased it was careful and precise, avoiding any escalation while still making her position clear. The audience reacted with a few soft murmurs of agreement, but overall remained restrained, as if recognizing the seriousness of the exchange. Chris Rock responded with a slight nod, signaling that he understood her perspective. But when he spoke again, there was a subtle shift in his tone, still calm but more direct than before. He clarified that he wasn't dismissing those reactions, but he questioned whether limiting what comedians can say would ultimately lead to more understanding or less. This was the moment where the disagreement became more defined. It wasn't about opposing each other personally, but about presenting two different ways of viewing the same issue. The conversation slowed down even further, with each response given space to land before the next began. One of the other co-hosts briefly interjected, offering a bridging perspective. She acknowledged both points, suggesting that there might be a balance between creative freedom and social awareness. Her tone was neutral, aiming to ease the tension without interrupting the flow of the discussion. It was a familiar dynamic on The View, where multiple voices contribute to shaping the conversation. Chris Rock listened, then added that he believes audiences are more capable of understanding nuance than they're often given credit for. He suggested that part of the role of comedy is to trust the audience to interpret material in their own way, rather than assuming a single reaction. As he spoke, his delivery remained steady, but there was a slight increase in emphasis on certain words, indicating that he was becoming more engaged in the discussion. The audience remained quiet, but attentive, with a few scattered nods visible among those seated in the front rows. Sunny Hostin responded by acknowledging the idea of audience interpretation, but she returned to her earlier point about responsibility. She explained that while audiences may interpret things differently, the initial message still carries weight, especially when it comes from someone with a large platform. Her voice remained calm, but her phrasing was deliberate. She wasn't interrupting, and she wasn't raising her voice, but she was clearly holding her ground. The exchange continued in this balanced but increasingly focused way, with neither side stepping back, but both maintaining a level of respect that kept the conversation from becoming confrontational. At this point, the pacing of the segment began to feel more intentional. The usual rhythm of quick exchanges and light commentary had been replaced by longer, more thoughtful responses. The hosts were allowing each other, and their guest, the time to fully express their points. Chris Rock leaned slightly forward again as he prepared to respond. He spoke about how comedy has historically been a way to address difficult topics, often before they're widely discussed in other settings. He suggested that removing that edge from comedy could limit its ability to spark meaningful conversations. The audience reacted with a small wave of applause, not loud or overwhelming, but noticeable enough to reflect a level of agreement. Sunny Hostin acknowledged the reaction with a brief glance toward the audience, then returned her focus to Chris Rock. She responded by clarifying that she wasn't advocating for removing comedy's edge entirely. Instead, she emphasized the importance of awareness, understanding how certain topics resonate with different audiences. Her tone remained composed, but there was a slight increase in emphasis, indicating that she was fully engaged in the discussion. The exchange between the two had now reached a point where each response felt like a direct continuation of the last. There was no longer any sense of a casual conversation. It had become a focused dialogue on a specific issue. Another co-host stepped in again, this time with a question that slightly shifted the angle of the discussion. She asked whether there is a difference between intent in a live performance versus how that same material is received when shared more widely, such as through clips or social media. This question introduced a new layer to the conversation, and both Sunny Hostin and Chris Rock seemed to recognize it as an opportunity to expand the discussion. Chris Rock responded first, explaining that context plays a significant role in how comedy is received. He pointed out that a joke told in a live setting, where the full performance is experienced, can feel very different from a short clip taken out of context. Sunny Hostin agreed with that point, acknowledging that context can influence interpretation. But she added that in today's media environment, where clips are widely shared, that context is not always guaranteed. Her tone remained steady, but her words carried a sense of practicality, reflecting the realities of modern media. The audience remained engaged, with occasional nods and quiet reactions, but no major interruptions. The energy in the room was focused, almost reflective, as if viewers were processing the discussion in real time. Chris Rock responded by saying that this very challenge, how content is shared and interpreted, is something that all public figures have to navigate. He didn't dismiss the concern, but he suggested that it shouldn't completely dictate how creative expression is approached. Sunny Hostin listened, then offered a final point in this portion of the discussion. She emphasized that while creativity is important, so is accountability. Her tone remained calm, but there was a clear sense of conviction in her words. At this stage, the disagreement had fully taken shape. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was clear, defined, and rooted in two different perspectives that weren't easily reconciled. The panel remained composed, the audience attentive, and the conversation continued to unfold in a way that felt both natural and significant. And as the segment moved forward, it became clear that this exchange was far from over. The discussion had deepened, the perspectives had been firmly established, and the conversation was beginning to explore even more nuanced aspects of the topic, setting the stage for what would come next. As the discussion carried forward, the atmosphere in the studio remained steady but noticeably more concentrated. What had started as a broad conversation about comedy and public perception had now settled into a more detailed exchange, where each point was being examined with care. On The View, this kind of progression isn't unusual, but the level of focus in the room suggested that both the panel and the audience understood the significance of what was being said. Chris Rock took a brief pause before continuing, as if organizing his thoughts. His posture remained composed, but there was a slight shift in his tone when he resumed speaking, still calm, but now carrying a bit more emphasis. He began to address the idea of accountability more directly, referencing how comedians often face immediate feedback from audiences, whether during live performances or afterward through public response. He explained that this feedback, in his view, is part of the natural process. If a joke doesn't land or is perceived negatively, the reaction itself becomes part of the conversation. He made it clear that he wasn't dismissing criticism, but rather seeing it as something that exists alongside creative expression, not necessarily something that should limit it entirely. As he spoke, his delivery remained steady, but his gestures became slightly more defined, reinforcing key points without becoming overly animated. The audience responded with quiet attentiveness, with a few subtle nods visible among those seated closer to the stage. Sunny Hostin listened closely, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a moment, maintaining a composed posture before leaning slightly forward again. When she began speaking, her tone remained measured, but there was a noticeable clarity in how she framed her response. She acknowledged that feedback is indeed part of the process, but she introduced another layer to the discussion. She pointed out that not all audiences have the same platform to respond, and that some reactions, especially from communities that feel directly impacted, may not always be heard in the same way. Her wording was careful, avoiding any sense of confrontation while still presenting a firm perspective. The audience reacted with a few soft murmurs, reflecting a level of engagement without disrupting the flow. The other hosts remained attentive, allowing the exchange to continue without interruption. Chris Rock nodded slightly, signaling that he understood her point. When he responded, his tone remained calm, but there was a subtle shift toward a more reflective approach. He acknowledged that different voices are heard in different ways, and that this imbalance can shape how conversations unfold. However, he returned to his earlier idea that open dialogue, even when imperfect, is still necessary. At this stage, the exchange had moved beyond simple disagreement. It had become a layered discussion, where each response built on the last, adding nuance rather than simply countering the previous point. The pacing remained deliberate, with pauses that allowed each statement to settle before the next began. One of the co-hosts briefly stepped in again, this time offering a personal observation. She spoke about how audience expectations have changed over time, noting that what may have been widely accepted in the past is now viewed differently. Her tone was neutral, aiming to provide context rather than take a side. This prompted Chris Rock to expand on his earlier comments about the evolution of comedy. He agreed that expectations have shifted, and he acknowledged that comedians have had to adjust in response. However, he emphasized that this adjustment doesn't always happen in a straight line. There are moments of trial and error, where material is tested and reactions vary. As he spoke, there was a slight increase in audience engagement, some quiet laughter at certain phrases, followed by attentive silence as he continued. The balance between lightness and seriousness remained, but the overall tone stayed grounded. Sunny Hostin responded by building on the idea of evolving expectations. She pointed out that as audiences become more aware of certain issues, their responses naturally change. Her tone remained steady, but there was a clear sense of purpose in her words. She wasn't dismissing the role of comedy, but she was reinforcing the importance of understanding its impact in a changing cultural context. The exchange between the two had now developed a rhythm, each response thoughtful, each point carefully considered. There were no interruptions, no raised voices, and no visible frustration. Instead, there was a consistent level of engagement that kept the discussion focused. At one point, a brief moment of levity emerged when another co-host made a light remark, drawing a small wave of laughter from the audience. It didn't disrupt the conversation, but it provided a brief pause in the intensity, allowing the atmosphere to reset slightly before returning to the main discussion. Chris Rock used that moment to transition into another aspect of his perspective. He spoke about the importance of intent once again, but this time with a slightly different emphasis. He explained that while impact is important, understanding the intention behind a statement can also shape how it is received. He suggested that conversations like this one, where different perspectives are shared openly, can help bridge that gap. Sunny Hostin listened, then responded by acknowledging that intent does play a role. However, she reiterated that for many viewers, the immediate impact of what they hear can be more significant than the intention behind it. Her tone remained composed, but there was a subtle firmness that indicated she was not shifting her position. The audience remained quiet, with occasional nods and soft reactions, but no major interruptions. The energy in the room was steady, focused, and reflective. As the discussion continued, the moderator briefly glanced at the clock, a subtle reminder that the segment was progressing. This often signals a shift toward wrapping up, but in this case, the conversation still had momentum. One of the co-hosts introduced a question that brought the discussion closer to real-world implications. She asked how public figures can navigate these challenges while still maintaining authenticity. It was a question that didn't take a side but encouraged both perspectives to offer practical insight. Chris Rock responded first, suggesting that authenticity comes from being willing to engage in conversations like this, even when they're not easy. He emphasized that avoiding difficult topics doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. His tone remained calm, but there was a slight emphasis that reflected his continued engagement. Sunny Hostin followed by offering her perspective, emphasizing that authenticity can also include being open to feedback and adjusting when necessary. Her tone remained consistent, measured, thoughtful, and firm without being confrontational. At this point, the discussion had reached a level of depth that felt complete in itself, yet still open-ended. There was no clear resolution, but there was a sense that both sides had been fully expressed. The audience responded with a brief round of applause, not loud or overwhelming, but enough to acknowledge the exchange. The panel maintained their composed demeanor, with subtle nods and brief glances exchanged among the hosts. As the segment moved toward its next phase, the tone remained steady, but there was a clear sense that this conversation had left an impression. It wasn't defined by conflict or resolution, but by the careful way in which each perspective had been presented and considered. And even as the discussion began to transition, the underlying tension, quiet, respectful, and grounded in differing viewpoints, remained present, setting the stage for how the final moments of the segment would unfold. As the segment moved into its later moments, there was a subtle but noticeable shift in how everyone at the table approached the conversation. The earlier back and forth had already established the core disagreement, and now the tone became slightly more reflective. On The View, this is often the point where discussions either begin to wind down or take on a more personal dimension, and in this case, it leaned toward the latter. Sunny Hostin adjusted her posture slightly, glancing briefly at her notes before returning her attention to Chris Rock. When she spoke, her tone remained calm, but there was a more conversational quality to it now, as if she was trying to connect the broader points they had been discussing to real-life experiences. She framed her next comment around how audiences today engage with media differently than they did even a decade ago. She mentioned how conversations that begin on television often continue online, sometimes taking on a life of their own. Her wording was careful, but it introduced a practical layer to the discussion. What happens after the cameras stop rolling? Chris Rock listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive. When he responded, his tone reflected that same shift toward reflection. He acknowledged that the conversation doesn't end when the show does, and he agreed that public reactions, especially online, can shape how moments are remembered. However, he added that this extended conversation isn't necessarily a negative thing. He suggested that ongoing dialogue, even when it includes disagreement, can lead to a better understanding over time. His delivery remained steady, but there was a slight softening compared to earlier moments, as if recognizing the shared ground within the discussion. The audience responded with a few quiet nods and a light murmur of agreement, signaling that the conversation was resonating. The intensity from earlier hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into something more measured and thoughtful. Sunny Hostin followed by acknowledging that point, agreeing that continued dialogue can be valuable. But she added that the speed and scale of modern reactions can sometimes amplify misunderstandings. Her tone remained even, but there was a sense of emphasis in her words, highlighting the challenges that come with that reality. At this point, one of the co-hosts stepped in again, offering an observation that seemed to bridge both perspectives. She noted that what the audience was witnessing in real time, this calm, respectful exchange, doesn't always translate the same way when reduced to short clips or headlines. Her comment drew a brief, knowing reaction from the audience, a mix of light laughter and agreement. Chris Rock responded with a slight smile, acknowledging that reality. He mentioned that context is often the first thing lost when conversations are shortened or shared in fragments. His tone remained composed, but there was a hint of familiarity in his delivery, as if speaking from experience. Sunny Hostin nodded, and for a moment, there was a brief sense of alignment between the two. It didn't erase their earlier differences, but it highlighted a shared understanding of how media works in practice. The conversation then shifted slightly toward personal responsibility, not in a confrontational way, but in a more introspective sense. Sunny Hostin asked how public figures can balance staying true to themselves while also being mindful of how their words are interpreted. Chris Rock took a moment before answering, leaning back slightly in his chair. His response was thoughtful, emphasizing that balance is something that evolves over time. He explained that experience plays a role in shaping how someone approaches these situations, and that learning from past reactions is part of that process. His tone remained calm, but there was a sense of sincerity in his words. He wasn't presenting a definitive answer, but rather describing an ongoing process. The audience responded with quiet attentiveness, with no interruptions or strong reactions, as if recognizing the nuance of the point. Sunny Hostin responded by acknowledging that growth and adjustment are important. She added that being open to listening, especially to those who may feel affected by certain statements, is a key part of that balance. Her tone remained consistent, steady, and thoughtful. As the exchange continued, the earlier tension seemed to settle into a more reflective rhythm. The disagreement was still present, but it no longer felt like a point of friction. Instead, it had become part of a broader conversation about how people communicate, respond, and adapt in a public space. Another co-host briefly brought the discussion back to the audience perspective, asking how viewers should approach conversations like this. It was a subtle shift, moving the focus from the speakers to those watching. Chris Rock responded by encouraging openness, suggesting that audiences benefit from hearing different viewpoints, even when they don't fully agree with them. His tone remained steady, and his phrasing was simple but clear. Sunny Hostin followed by adding that viewers should also feel comfortable forming their own opinions, based on both what is said and how it is said. She emphasized that critical thinking plays an important role in how these conversations are received. The audience responded with a small round of applause, not loud but clearly supportive of the idea. It was one of the few moments in the segment where there was a collective reaction, reflecting a shared sense of understanding. As the discussion approached its final stretch, the moderator began to guide the conversation toward a conclusion. This wasn't done abruptly, but through subtle cues, shorter questions, more concise responses, and a slight shift in pacing. Chris Rock offered a closing thought, reiterating that conversations like this are important, even when they don't lead to immediate agreement. His tone remained calm and composed, consistent with how he had approached the entire segment. Sunny Hostin responded with a closing perspective of her own, emphasizing that respectful dialogue is key, especially when discussing topics that can affect different people in different ways. Her delivery was steady, and her expression remained focused. The audience responded with another brief round of applause, slightly more pronounced than before, signaling appreciation for the discussion as a whole. At this point, the tension that had defined the middle of the segment had largely settled. What remained was a sense of thoughtful engagement, a conversation that had explored different viewpoints without escalating beyond control. The panel shared a few brief exchanges, lighter in tone, as the segment prepared to transition. It was a natural shift, reflecting the structure of live television, where even serious discussions eventually give way to the next topic. But despite that transition, It was clear that this conversation had left an impression. It wasn't defined by a single moment, but by the way it unfolded, gradually, respectfully, and with a level of depth that kept both the panel and the audience fully engaged. And as the show moved closer to wrapping up the segment, there was a quiet understanding that what had just taken place would likely continue beyond the studio, in the conversations that viewers would carry with them afterward. As the segment reached its final moments, the overall tone in the studio had settled into something calm and reflective. What had started as a routine discussion on The View had gradually evolved into a thoughtful exchange that, while marked by clear differences in perspective, remained grounded in mutual respect. There was no abrupt ending, no attempt to force agreement, just a natural winding down of a conversation that had been allowed to unfold in real time. The moderator gave a brief closing remark, thanking Chris Rock for joining the panel. The transition was smooth, but there was a slight pause before moving on, as if allowing the weight of the discussion to settle with the audience. Chris Rock acknowledged the panel with a nod and a brief smile, maintaining the composed demeanor he had carried throughout the segment. Sunny Hostin also offered a short closing comment, reiterating the importance of conversations like the one they had just had. Her tone remained consistent, measured and thoughtful, without revisiting the disagreement directly. It felt less like a final argument and more like a closing reflection. The audience responded with a warm round of applause, more sustained than earlier moments. It wasn't the kind of reaction driven by excitement, but rather one that signaled appreciation. The applause carried a sense of acknowledgement for the discussion itself, its tone, its depth, and the way it had been handled. As the cameras began to pull back slightly and the show prepared to cut to a commercial break, there were small, natural interactions at the table. A few of the co-hosts exchanged brief comments off mic, and Chris Rock shared a quick, polite remark with the panel. Nothing appeared tense or unresolved in a visible way. Instead, there was a sense that the conversation had reached a natural stopping point. For viewers watching live, the segment likely stood out not because it was dramatic, but because it felt real. It reflected the kind of discussion that happens outside of television as well, measured, occasionally tense, but ultimately respectful. The pacing, the pauses, and the tone all contributed to that feeling. Once the episode aired in full, reactions began to appear across social media platforms. Short clips from the segment started circulating, particularly the moments where the disagreement between Chris Rock and Sunny Hostin became most defined. As is often the case, these clips varied in length and context, with some focusing on specific lines or exchanges. Viewer responses reflected a range of perspectives. Some expressed agreement with Chris Rock's emphasis on creative freedom and the role of comedy in addressing difficult topics. Others supported Sunny Hostin's focus on impact and responsibility, highlighting the importance of understanding how words are received by different audiences. There were also many viewers who appreciated the tone of the exchange itself. Comments noted that the discussion remained respectful and that both perspectives were given space to be heard. In a media environment where conversations can sometimes become polarized, this aspect stood out to many. In the hours following the broadcast, a few media outlets and commentators began referencing the segment as part of a broader conversation about comedy and public discourse. Rather than framing it as a conflict, much of the coverage focused on the substance of what was said. The discussion was seen as an example of how differing viewpoints can be explored without escalating into confrontation. Clips from The View continued to circulate, and with each repost, new interpretations emerged. Some viewers focused on specific statements, while others looked at the overall dynamic between Chris Rock and Sunny Hostin. This variation in response mirrored the very topic they had been discussing: how different audiences interpret the same content in different ways. In a follow-up segment later in the week, the panel briefly referenced the conversation. Sunny Hostin clarified that her intention had been to highlight the importance of considering audience perspectives, not to limit creative expression. Her tone remained consistent with how she had approached the original discussion: calm, thoughtful, and focused on clarity. While Chris Rock did not appear again immediately, his comments during the segment continued to be referenced in ongoing discussions online. Supporters pointed to his emphasis on open dialogue, while others revisited Sunny Hostin's points about impact and accountability. The conversation extended beyond the show, becoming part of a larger dialogue about how public figures communicate in a rapidly evolving media landscape. Back in the studio, as the original episode transitioned into its next segment, The shift in tone was noticeable but expected. Lighter topics followed, and the pacing returned to the familiar rhythm of daytime television. However, for viewers who had watched the earlier exchange, the impression remained. What made the moment stand out wasn't any single statement, but the way the discussion unfolded. There were no interruptions that derailed the conversation, no raised voices that shifted it into conflict. Instead, it was defined by careful listening, measured responses, and a willingness to engage with differing viewpoints. For many viewers, that approach felt closer to how real conversations should happen, especially on a platform like The View, where multiple perspectives are part of the format. The segment served as a reminder that disagreement doesn't have to mean division, and that tone can shape how a message is received just as much as the message itself. As the discussion continued to circulate online, it became clear that its impact wasn't limited to the original broadcast. Viewers brought their own interpretations, experiences, and perspectives into the conversation, extending it far beyond the studio. And in the end, that may have been the most lasting takeaway. Not who was right or wrong, but how the conversation was handled. It demonstrated that even in moments of disagreement, there is value in listening, responding thoughtfully, and allowing space for different viewpoints to exist. Now it's your turn. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.